Hello, Scott. Again, thank you for agreeing to be a part of this research. Let's get started. Tell me, what is your experience with the view graph or transparency in overhead projector?
My first exposure to the overhead projector, I would say, would start in the late 1960s in elementary school and would continue, I would say, through the late 1980s, through my first job.
Okay. That leads to my next question. What is your background with classroom instruction, either as a facilitator or as a student?
Well, as I just mentioned, through elementary school all the way through high school, I was exposed some form or fashion with the overhead projector classes, as far as examples, as far as some instructors actually gave us tests via the overhead.
Okay.
It was easier that way, so you didn't have to pass out a paper copy. It was harder for people to cheat that way, I think is what it came down to.
Okay.
And then I joined the military in the 1980s. I became a small unit instructor, and I worked at the Recruit Administrative Processing Center at Parris Island. So I would have to provide classroom instruction on how to fill out certain forms for the newly arrived applicants, which were then recruits at that stage, on how to fill out certain forms, what information went where, an exact sequence of information to be applied to that form.
Okay.
It just made it easier.
I see. I think you've answered that question. Have you ever used the view graph and overhead projector in the classroom? That's a good example.
Yeah, both those examples, both as a small unit leader, as far as laying out, a lot of it was laying out maps and routes that we would take to certain objectives. Our defensive positions would be assigned via the overhead graph, so people would get the actual visual along with the verbal guidance. It just made it easier to assimilate. And then in the instruction portion of Recruit Admin, it gave them the verbal that, hey, this is what we're working on, this is exactly the sequence that we need, put into certain blocks, exact information. It made it easier for the applicant to visualize what I wanted along with our verbal, because they weren't always listening.
Okay. Have you ever participated or presented instruction where the transparency and overhead projector was used?
Yes, both those situations, both as a small unit leader and as an instructor at Recruit Admin Center on filling out various forms, procedures, information, providing them phone numbers, addresses, points of contact for them to write down, send home to mom and dad. This was their initial entrance into the Marine Corps, so there was a lot of information to be provided, and just telling them it would be hard to do.
Okay. Can you tell me why it was decided to use the view graph and overhead projector in this setting?
Because it was a repetitive class, meaning we would give 3 classes in the morning and then 2 classes in the evening. Same information, same examples needed. It just didn't make sense to constantly be writing that information on boards. And with whiteboards back then, I mean, you run the risk of someone erasing it, information being changed. With the overhead projector, you just flip up the chart, it was there, and you knew exactly what was coming.
Okay. Your experience in the classroom, either as a facilitator or a student, do you feel that the view graph and overhead projector enhanced the learning?
I do, because it provided that visual stimulation that enhanced our verbal guidance.
Okay.
A lot of times, especially with the newly arrived recruits, they were a little strung out, a little sleep deprived. They weren't always listening to us because the anxiety level was up there. So providing them that visual stimulation kind of brought back, okay, this is what I'm doing.
Okay.
So I do believe it was a necessary tool.
To help them to focus their attention?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have a certain appreciation about the functionality of the view graph and the overhead projector?
I do. I believe it was important as a tool to use for classes that were reoccurring. Because you could pre-plan, you could make your transparency deck up in advance, proofread it in advance, practice it. It helped ensure that you stayed on track with your presentation, because it was an active part of your presentation, not like the current stuff where you're flipping. You actually had a few seconds in between switching transparencies to give you time to think of what was going on, review your little notes on the side. So I do think it was an important part of instruction.
Okay, so at the time, you do think that compared to, or I should say compared to the tools, the technology that we use today, there were some advantages to the transparency in the view graph.
At that stage, it was the only tool available, to our accessibility in the early 80s. It was either just stand in front of someone and lecture them,
Okay.
or use the view graph, the overhead projector, to provide the visual stimulation. Or you had to sit there with a whiteboard and draw everything out in advance, which sometimes I don't have the best handwriting.
All right.
So it was very difficult for people to read my handwriting, where I could type out what I wanted, make the transparencies, and they were easily read by everyone in the class.
Okay, when you say the whiteboard, so that we don't get confused with the whiteboard that's used today, or the interactive boards that are used today. When you say whiteboard, you mean the dry erase boards?
It was basically a
Like
chalkboard or a whiteboard, yes, with markers, yes.
Okay. Do you have any criticisms about the functionality of the view graph in the overhead projector?
The criticism, I would say, would come from user preference. It was, you had to create the transparencies, you had to maintain control of those transparencies. If they got out of order, out of sequence, when you're sitting there looking at them, you don't always look at the slide before you pop it on the screen. If someone has shuffled your slide deck, you've got the wrong slide up there. Errors weren't as easy to correct back then. I mean, if you created a document and then created that transparency off that document, spelling errors or misinformation, you had to recreate the entire document, or create another transparency. It required quite a bit of pre-planning. Back then, most of the classrooms were set up with an overhead projector as part of that classroom. It was just a functional part of most periods of instruction.
Right.
If you were going to an area that wasn't normally a classroom or used for instruction, they were quite bulky. They weren't really heavy, but I mean, you had to have a cart, ensure you had an electrical supply, ensure you brought everything with spare light bulbs,
Right.
all of that with you. So it did have some downsides to it.
Right. It's interesting that you talk about the slides being out of order for whatever reason. That could cause an awkward pause in your presentation if you were speaking about one topic, but you had the wrong slide portrayed up on the screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
It did quite, to be honest with you, that was a quite common endeavor to overcome, because even though you would mark your slide deck 1, 2, 3,
Right.
when you're giving the presentation, you just assumed you were right. If you were in a hurry, you came in, maybe you were rushed, got there at the last moment, didn't have time to review your slide deck, and just assumed it was as you left it. You just start throwing them up there, and they're out of sequence.
Let me ask you this: what academic benefits do you see in using the view graph and overhead projector in the classroom?
Academic benefit, it would go back to, it reinforces the various ways an individual learns. Some people need that visual stimulation to trigger, memory. Others need the association of a verbal context with the visual stimulation. I think any time you can use a tool to reach someone, to retain information, it's going to enhance the learning process.
So instead of just the lecturer standing in front of a group of students talking about a certain topic, if the key points were also available on a screen,
Yes.
you feel that that enhances the
I
learning?
do, and that's a critical point there. You can't just throw everything up on the screen.
Mm.
It's gotta be relevant, and it's gotta drive home points.
Right.
So when used properly, yes, I definitely believe it did enhance the students' learning process in a classroom, so.
Okay. Do you often see the view graph and overhead projector being used in the classroom today? And by that, again, the transparency and overhead projector. Do you see that at all being used today?
No, but I'm currently not taking any classes, I'm not giving any classes,
I see.
so I have not seen it in years.
Okay. Well, I was gonna ask you, if not, why do you think that is? And I think you answered that, in your estimation. It could still be used in some classrooms.
It could, yes.
Okay.
With today's technology, though, I don't see why it would be.
Okay. Speaking of that, what technology do you think replaced the view graph or the transparency and overhead projector?
I think the readily accessible access to laptops and computers and the software packages that would be put on those computers has changed. PowerPoint, for example. PowerPoint is the same development of a transparency, basically.
Mm.
It's easy to change, it's easy to project, you now have an in-focus machine. As I stated earlier, most of the classrooms back then, a standard feature of a classroom was an overhead projector set up in the front of the classroom. Nowadays, a classroom has an overhead projector mounted in the ceiling,
Right.
or an in-focus machine situated on a table in front of the classroom, where you just hook your laptop up, project your images, and go.
Right.
So the concept is the same,
Mm-hmm.
it's just the tools used are a little bit different.
It's interesting that you mentioned in this conference room, we have the screen there,
Yes.
which is available. We have the Proxima displayer mounted in the ceiling, and there's a laptop in the back of this classroom.
Yes.
Just about anywhere you go, that software and hardware is available.
Standard hardware, yes.
Now, why do you think that PowerPoint or slide presentation software, the laptop, and the projectors of today, why do you think that they replaced what we used 10, 15, 20 years ago in the transparency and overhead projector?
I think the technology is just a normal progression in life. It made creating, modifying, and displaying the items a lot easier. Again, I can have a PowerPoint slide, I can be in the middle of a brief, see a mistake and correct it on the spot.
Mm.
Whereas with an old transparency, I may be displaying something and notice that misinformation is up on the screen, and instead of being able to correct it right then and there, I would have to explain, there's a mistake on the slide, disregard. I would have to go back, recreate that Word document with the new information, create another transparency, and put it in the slide deck.
Mm.
Technology has taken us to the point where everything is immediate.
Mm. Okay.
Where, as like I said, with transparencies and overheads, a lot of pre-planning and thought process had to go into what you were going to do.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Let me ask this. Do you have any further comments to make regarding the view graph and the overhead projector? You've been very helpful. I think you've covered just about all of the questions that I've asked. You provided a lot of good insight into the research that's being conducted here.
I just can't wait to see what's next.
After the Proxima and the
Yes.
PowerPoint slide presentation software. Right, that's interesting.
Yes.
What's next?
3D.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point there,
Yeah.
quite honestly. Never thought about what's next. We're talking about what has obsolesced, what technology. We know what it was and what it is today, but quite honestly, in the context of this class that I'm taking, I wasn't thinking about what comes next.
What's next? Yeah.
Think about what it was, what it is, but I haven't thought about what's next. That's an interesting perspective. Okay, Scott, I thank you very much.